Patrick Henningsen and TNT.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. This is the final hour of the Patrick Henningsen Show on TNT, today's news talk. Fantastic segment just before the break with independent French journalist and researcher Freddie Ponton. And at the end of that segment, you'll note he weighed in on Emmanuel Macron's precarious role in trying to negotiate or to move the Minsk peace process down the road. Of course, that was to no avail. So poor Macron is sort of left in the lurch with his election gambit there that he was trying to engineer. So, this is a fluid story with regards to Russia and Ukraine. We're going to delve a little bit deeper into this in this final hour. And I'm pleased to welcome onto the show former British ambassador to Syria and Bahrain, and his name is Peter Ford, and he's joining me on the line right now. Hello, Peter.
Hello, Patrick.
Hello, thank you for joining us. I wish it was a better occasion, but as often is the case, Peter, we can't predict what's going to happen in the world. Firstly, I'm just going to ask you, what are your impressions of what has happened this morning?
Well, it's a fast-moving situation, but it appears that Russia has drawn its line in the sand. The Americans were moving more and more assets over the last several months into Ukraine, and was beginning to behave as though Ukraine was already a member of NATO. The dividing line between NATO and non-NATO was becoming more and more hazy. I think by now moving to consolidate the position of the independent republics of Donbass and Lugansk, Russia has drawn that line in the sand. And the West are leaving Russia with few options but to go further by imposing draconian sanctions without waiting for Russia to take what were previously thought to be the steps that would prompt for sanctions, that is, a full-fledged invasion of Ukraine. The West is leaving Putin with very few options and very little to lose. He must be saying to himself, I might as well do a bit of regime change of my own. It can be accomplished with relative ease, I believe, and I suspect that this is the path we are now on.
And Peter, I know that you spent your career in the diplomatic corps, studying international relations, studying geography, understanding people and cultures. I know this is very important working in the Middle East, especially important in a country like Syria, where you were also stationed. So, in terms of the geographical, historical, cultural, and political dynamics, all of those things together, vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia, you can look at this with an analytical mind, and I'm sure you have. So I'm going to ask you this question. Are you surprised by the actions of the Russian government in the last week?
Not at all, because the Americans have been creating the precedents, and specifically in Syria, although this is very little mentioned. The Americans put troops into northeast Syria several years ago, allegedly in order to defeat ISIS. Well, ISIS has been defeated for a long time now, and yet those American troops are still there, propping up a sort of autonomous government led by their favorite ethnic community in that part of the world, the Kurds. So there are direct parallels with what Russia, with all the more right, being a neighbor, has done in the eastern part of Ukraine, supporting oppressed Russian speakers there. But nobody says a word about the American control over northeast Syria, denying the people of Syria access to the very important resources of oil and grain in that area. And then NATO ally Turkey effectively made a land grab for northwest Syria a few years ago, inserting thousands of troops to install their own kind of puppet jihadi regime in Idlib and to sustain it in that position, killing hundreds of Syrian government troops in the process. And NATO seems to think this is just fine and dandy. So we can hardly squeal now if Russia has moved to help some fellow Russians in their own backyard.
And, I'll go into Russia's got a sort of specific experience in Syria, which I think is very relevant to what we're seeing now in terms of militarily, strategically. It's just suffice to say they've had a bit of practice in this department in recent years with regards to Syria. But more importantly, the speech by Vladimir Putin before he formally recognized the breakaway republics of Donetsk and Lugansk, which is quite an unusual address in that the length of it was over an hour, and he kind of gave his historical retrospective of Ukrainian and Russian history, from around, before the Bolshevik Revolution, but going forward, especially in the 20th century. And his remarks were along the lines, Peter, that the Ukraine as a country was very much a political construct during the Soviet era, made even more complicated by the rule of Nikita Khrushchev, in also how he annexed Crimea in 1954 to Ukraine as part of the Soviet states, and then the breakup of the Soviet Union and what happened after 1991. And the argument that Russia's making is, look, this is not. It's almost, he didn't say it, Peter, but it's a failed state. And you know what? After the coup in Maidan in February of 2014, I personally have a hard time arguing with that, because what happened after the coup, they basically drew polarized sectarian lines and cut off the Russian-speaking enclaves from the political process and outlawed the Russian language in some parts of the country. I mean, so that's not really a recipe for a cohesive nation state, is it? But what are your thoughts on that side of things?
Well, it was very useful that Putin gave us this history lesson, because we in the West seem to think that history began just yesterday. The media behave as though nothing that mattered before yesterday counts. We also have a tendency to think about one simple element of our own history, and that is Munich and appeasement. So that any concessions to a foreign power are rapidly characterized as Munich and appeasement. And this holds us back from exercising any any type of caution or even common sense. Everything is reduced to a sort of image of Putin as an amalgamation of Hitler, Mussolini, Bonaparte, and Genghis Khan. This rabid simplification of things down to one man is quite striking. On the Russian side, there's clearly a much more nuanced analysis. But here, we boil everything down to a very simple equation: Putin bad, West good.
Yes, that's the general theme. So now, one of the big problems here, is that you're talking about the West or NATO. They're really wanting to manage this neighborhood. They're wanting to manage the politics. They're wanting to manage the military affairs, and specifically the NATO membership aspirations of some factions within the current government in Ukraine. It's not to say the whole country is interested in this, clearly not, but there is a pro-Western, pro-NATO faction that the EU quartered them, and that was the big promise, Peter, from the Maidan coup, was that you'll be let into Europe if you just overthrow this pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych. The doors of the EU will open, and the young people came out, and they captured their imagination. And then NATO is being used in the same sort of way. They're selling NATO as an ideological organization now, a political organization, a pro-democracy organization. And Jan Stoltenberg's speech today, he said that NATO expansion means the expansion of democracy, effectively. And Russia's basically not having this anymore. And clearly that's what happened this morning. It was kind of a step too far. But so, from an international law point of view, how do you think this is going to be looked at? We know how the US and the UK are looking at it, and some of the other European countries. But how do you think this is going to be in a broader perspective? How are you looking at this?
Yeah. Well, first of all, international law, it depends on how much money you've got to spend on lawyers. You can always find lawyers who will argue for one thing or for its opposite. And with Ukraine, the legal situation appears to be messy. You have the principle of non-acquisition of territory by force and non-aggression on the one hand, and you have self-determination of peoples on the other. They both have legitimacy in terms of international law. It all depends on who's doing it to whom. America has endorsed the Israeli illegal annexation of territory in Palestine and in the Syrian Golan, with no thought whatsoever to international legality. So let's leave that on one side. And by the way, the Americans and the West generally like to talk about the need for a rules-based system. They run away from calling it a law-based system precisely because they are in contravention of international law themselves. As I mentioned earlier, the Turkish and American presence in Syria is totally illegal. So let's leave law on one side. But let's look more importantly at long-term consequences. If Russia had not moved decisively, then bit by bit, Ukraine would have gone into the ambit of NATO, even if not formally becoming a member. The Americans were already stationing forward assets into Ukraine and effectively threatening Russia. American missiles would be, as Russia has pointed out, just minutes away from Moscow. So sooner or later, Russia would have been, in their own estimation, if no one else's, but it would have happened. Russia would have moved, and it's possible that had this situation been left to fester for a few more years, the consequences could have been more dire than they're already going to be. So, in fact, arguably, we have avoided World War III by what we're seeing now. because sooner or later there would have been a big confrontation, and it might be better for Russia to make this surgical operation now to stop the cancer spreading and killing the body.
That's a thing that concerned me.
Very close. Yeah. You always have to think about what would have happened if you hadn't taken a course of action. What trajectory did Washington and London think they were on, with constantly encouraging Ukraine's illusions about NATO membership?
And also, you can't discount Russia's relationship with Russian-speaking Russian populations within Ukraine, and we don't hear any mention of the 4 million people living in this part of eastern Ukraine. It's as if they've been depersoned by the West, and that speaks to another broader point, Peter. Do you think that? I mean, I'm somewhat concerned that there's this kind of cultural conditioning in the West that has degraded Russian people to a kind of where it's safe to demonize and to make them the enemy, this sort of low second tier humans. You mentioned Putin being this kind of comic book villain that he's been characterized in the West as, but they don't seem to have any concern and almost revel in the suffering of Russians, much like they do in other people in other countries. But that, to me, Peter, I didn't even see that to that level in the Cold War, although I know it existed in the Cold War. You could probably comment more on that, the stereotyping and things like that in America. But that really disturbs me, because then I'm like, is there a chance that the Western public can bring their politicians to their senses in this atmosphere of this kind of international bigotry? But what are your thoughts on that side of things?
I'm not optimistic. I mean, the cacophony, the propaganda that we're reeling under at the moment in Britain is amazing. It wall to wall. All dissenting voices are crushed. You have the Labour Party demanding the silencing of the RT Russian television channel. We lost our moorings in reality and fairness and decency. You can be anti-Russian now when you can't be anti-Muslim or anti-Israeli. But Russophobia is in fact very fashionable. At the moment, the brunt of it is being borne by President Putin and oligarchs. But there's a subtext here against the Russian people generally, reflected in, as you mentioned, ignoring the plight of the people of Russian ethnic origin in eastern Ukraine.
Yeah, because that's clearly, from a humanitarian standpoint, plus from a political standpoint, is just really untenable. And at every turn, it seemed like the U.S. doesn't even talk about the Minsk Accords. I never heard it mentioned until the last 48 hours, Peter. All of a sudden, the U.S. is saying he's not following the Minsk Accords. It's the first time I've ever heard it mentioned in U.S. media in 8 years or 7 years until the last 2 days. But who's been undermining it the whole way? It's with the U.S. pushing these various Ukrainian presidents that they've installed to basically sabotage it. So it was really, I think, dead. It was a non-starter. It seems like Russia realized in the last, especially in the last couple of weeks, when things have really come to a head, that they weren't getting anything back on the other side, just accusations and epithets and accusations of false flags. Go ahead.
There's a parallel with the Middle East peace process, which are similar to the Minsk Accords, in that they've become an excuse for maintaining the status quo. and there not being any serious intention on the part of the Americans and their allies to implement these agreements, either of them, the Middle East peace process or the Minsk Accords. They just become a cover for building on the status quo.
And the other thing is that was really interesting was the OSCE, which is ostensibly a neutral organization, probably one of the more neutral organizations in the kind of international multilateral organizational framework there. And they reported shelling coming from the Ukrainian military side into the Donbass, a massive increase, especially after Moscow recognized these two breakaway republics. So that was a signal, it seemed, to Moscow that there wasn't going to be any ceasefire. There wasn't going to be any peace, that Kiev is really on a kind of a mission and NATO's on a mission. And do you think that NATO wanted this outcome? Because if you think about it, NATO is now front and center. They're all of a sudden, Peter, they're relevant again. Military budgets are going to be, record high in the next, who knows, 10 years. How long is this? Are we in a new Cold War? What are your thoughts on that side of things?
I doubt that it was pre-planned. NATO, I think, blundered into this. NATO was complacent, thinking that it could advance up to the Russian borders without consequence. It hasn't been ready for Russia's retaliation, which has been a long time coming. It's 7 years since the Western-backed coup in Kiev. The only surprise, really, is that it's taken so long. But no, I don't think NATO had pre-planned this, but you're right that it's reaping windfall gains. It has appeared to become more relevant, while in fact what's really going on is being masked. We talk about NATO when what we really mean is the US. NATO has never been anything more than the instrument that America uses to keep Europe under control. And sadly, this perception that NATO has an authentic existence and is not just a cat's paw for America, I'm afraid this impression has been reinforced by the crisis. And also, as you mentioned, military budgets are set to blossom even further as a result of all this, and precisely at a moment when the world economy, Western economies, least need it. But there is another dimension, and that's China. Perhaps we could discuss this.
Oh, absolutely. What are your thoughts on that aspect?
Well, how long you got?
Well,
in a way, this is the most important.
Well,
I'll be brief.
Before we talk about China, because they're also weighing in on this right now, but Ukraine has asked Turkey to ban Russian ships from Black Sea routes. We're talking about closing the access to the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles Straits, basically cutting off Russia's access to the Mediterranean. Now, that's also one of your areas, I think, of understanding is that part of the world. What do you think what do you think the odds of this actually happening are? And B, if it was to happen, what would be the ramifications of that?
I don't think it has a snowflake in hell's chance of happening. Turkey would not be so stupid. It would be a breach of many long-standing international agreements, and even more importantly, it would expose Turkey to savage Russian retaliation. Turkey is in some extremely vulnerable positions in Syria. where Russia is very strong. And by the way, this move underlines how smart Russia has been to develop the port of Tartus in Syria, and over the last several years has made Tartus a very capable station for a Russian fleet. So even if the Dardanelles were briefly closed, Russia still has a foothold in the Mediterranean with the Tartus naval station. But as I say, it's not going to come to that. Turkey is not totally stupid, far from it. I think this is just Ukraine trying to rattling the bars, just trying to get attention, do the obvious things, and ramp up international, particularly Western hysteria.
Mm-hmm. So that also brings us to the to Asia. We're getting closer to Asia with that story. So if you could have a bird, a fly on the wall view of what's going on in Beijing right now, what do you think the Chinese are thinking, looking at this situation right now?
Well, it's pretty clear that Putin's last and recent visit to Beijing was aimed at making sure that that China had his back, and that's clearly what's happened. The Chinese have their own fish to fry with America, and have a parallel situation with Taiwan. They're fed up of American meddling over China's provinces, Hong Kong, human rights activism. China basically agrees with Russia that it's time to draw a line in the sand and to stop this headlong advance by America into other people's spheres of influence. I mean, effectively what America is saying is that Russia has no right to have a sphere of influence on its borders. Only America can have a sphere of influence in Europe. And similarly, China isn't allowed to have its sphere of influence in Asia. So that these two important powers, China and Russia, are now making effectively a common stand. They're both drawing this line in the sand, and America will need to take that into account, because China could create another crisis at the drop of a hat.
Yeah, if you look at U.S. media right now, Peter, and you listen to the punditry class over there in the U.S., they're saying Xi Jinping is looking very closely at this situation. If the U.S. and NATO don't act decisively to stop Putin, they're going to take that as a green light to grab Taiwan within weeks or maybe months. So that's the verbatim, the basic conversation that's circulating right now on the Fox News Network, CNN, and so forth. So this is what the hawks are saying in the U.S. And so I don't think, maybe I'm wrong here, but China is not interested in starting a new Cold War. I don't think Russia is. But then is the West interested in starting a new Cold War? I'm not sure I know the answer to that, Peter. What do you think?
They don't want it, but they may blunder into it. It seems that America's basically overreached across the globe, and both Russia and China are saying if this goes on unchecked, God knows where it will take. It will take us into a hot war. So they are saying you've reached your high water mark. Stop overreaching. and we can come to accommodations. I mean, you can argue, as CNN and others are doing, that not responding to Russia in Ukraine makes it more likely that China will intervene over Taiwan. But I think the opposite is more likely to be true, that if America is so reckless as to get involved militarily in Eastern Europe, China will move quickly to take advantage of America being embroiled in Europe to make its own move on Taiwan, because the American forces, big as they are, can't run two major wars at the same time.
Yes, that's true. That's true. And not only that, Russia's effectively fighting on its home pitch. China would be fighting on their home pitch. So there's an inherent advantage in that as well. I would have thought they would have learned their lesson in Syria, Peter, on that, but apparently not. They're still pushing for it. So I don't know if there's a bit of a delusional aspect to this kind of the foreign policy establishment in the Beltway in Washington. Much the same with unfortunately in London as well. Hasn't always been that vociferous in London, as far as I can recall. It's become more sort of detached from reality in recent years. Go ahead.
Just a brief word about London, because here there's an internal domestic political dimension. Boris Johnson has been trying to ramp up the tension to help himself. He's politically he's under fire for the so-called Partygate scandal. He's being investigated by the police for apparent breaches of the lockdown regulations. He could be in serious trouble, but this Ukraine crisis has come along at an opportune moment for him. He's helping to ratchet up the pressure and the hysteria on a daily basis, and it's all just distracting from Partygate, and making every day that passes makes it less likely that these police investigations will lead anywhere. So Boris Johnson has these immediate tactical considerations in mind as well, while the British Labour Party is also trying to exploit the crisis again by ramping up the hysteria, because they feel they have to do down their image from the days when Jeremy Corbyn was leading the Labour Party, and the media created this impression that Corbyn was Putin's ally, and Labour, since they got rid of Corbyn, have been moving further and further to the right on international affairs, have totally forgotten that they used to be the party for peace, and are now the biggest warmongers. It's the British Labour Party, which is now demanding the silencing of the Russian television station in UK, RT.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute. We're going to take a short break. Thank you. We're with Peter Ford here, former UK ambassador to Syria and Bahrain. We're discussing the Ukraine, Russia, and NATO situation, which is fluid and breaking right now. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. You're listening to TNT, Today's News Talk. We'll be right back.
The mission of Paralyzed Veterans of America is clear: accessibility. Veterans who have served and sacrificed the best of themselves deserve access to the best our country has to offer. Access to meaningful employment. Access to the veterans' benefits they've earned. Accessible homes and vehicles. And access to every part of their communities. With PVA staff working inside VA hospitals, no other veterans organization has provided more real-time, ongoing support for paralyzed veterans and their families. PVA is proud to serve veterans across all branches, all generations, and all conflicts. Our nation's heroes fought for your independence. Join PVA in fighting for theirs. at pva.org.
I will be right by your side.
Women can have it all, including heart attacks. But symptoms like jaw pain, nausea, unusual fatigue, dizziness, and backache are often different and more subtle than for a man. The fact is, heart disease is the #1 killer of women. Know the signs. Learn more at getheartchecked.org. From Women's Heart Alliance, in partnership with Women Heart.
We've all been told how important it is to take the COVID vaccine, but there's another side you don't hear about. Meet Maddie. She's 13. She believes in vaccines. She signed up for Pfizer's clinical trial. Today, she can't walk. Maddie still believes in vaccines and is trying her hardest to make a difference. Maddie stepped up for America. Let's step up for Maddie. Learn about Maddie. Go to vacsafety.org. Paid for by the Vaccine Safety Research Foundation.
Where progress is influenced by revolution and evolution. This is today's News Talk Radio. TNT.
Welcome back. This is TNT, Today's News Talk. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. We're rolling into the last segment of the third hour here. And on the line with me is a former UK ambassador to Syria and Bahrain, Peter Ford, veteran diplomat, but also a expert really in international affairs. And Peter, I wanted to we'll talk about the RT situation and that whole thing. But, on the ground, you're looking at a situation right now, and obviously it's developing as we speak. When we hang up, there'll probably be a lot of things that have happened during the course of this segment. But so Russia, if you look at their recent experience in Syria, and you look at, like, say, how the United States and NATO just basically exfiltrated themselves out of Afghanistan in not the most eloquent way, so, 6+ years, going on 7 years in Syria, Russia has had to make a lot of difficult calls in Syria with regards to, you have the Americans on one side, you have the Turks on the other. They're also doing a pipeline deal with the Turks. You've got Syria as well. You've got Israel doing airstrikes daily. And to the point, Peter, where there's no clean options. And Russia, I think, has managed that situation, but gradually improved the overall situation for Damascus over the last 7 years. So they're coming out of what looks like to a lot of people as success in a very, very difficult, some say impossible situation with the proxy war in Syria. Going into this situation, managing it, it can't. Maybe I'm wrong. I can't see it being more complicated than the Middle East. So, do you think the West might be underestimating Russia's ability to manage this situation, considering their recent experience? But go ahead.
Definitely. The Western pundits were rubbing their hands in glee at the prospect of the Russians getting into a quagmire in Syria. Quagmire is exactly what the Americans got themselves into with their invasions and occupations of places like Vietnam. In a classic case of Freudian projection, CNN and those others were looking forward to Russia getting bogged down in a quagmire in Syria. The opposite happened. Russia has taken very few hits in Syria. It hasn't had to deploy vast forces as it happens, but those it has deployed, it's done so very skillfully and to effect, using local allies, particularly the Syrian government forces. And the upshot has been, even grudgingly accepted by many Western pundits, has been a Russian success. President Assad remains in power with Russian support. Russia has consolidated its military position in the Mediterranean, as we discussed earlier. It's managed to do this while confronting Turkey and Israel over their own Syrian incursions, and yet it has managed to remain on speaking terms with both. But perhaps most importantly, if we're making a comparison with Ukraine and Syria, it is the military dimension. And based on their Syrian experience, and by the way, the Russians have had more direct, recent military experience than anybody in the world under real fire, not training conditions, and their weaponry has been much improved, and their tactics honed as a result of operations in Syria. I believe this will stand Russia in good stead in Ukraine, and I don't want to stick my neck out, but I would expect any Russian campaign in Ukraine to be quite short-lived.
Yes, and do you know they've also administrated no-fly zones in Syria quite effectively in butting up against the U.S. Air Force at the same time. Very, very complicated, and Turkey managed to manage that situation. So, could they hold a no-fly zone over eastern Ukraine? What are their odds of success if that happens? That could happen in the next 2 days. But what do you think?
I think that without too much difficulty, they could impose a no-fly zone over the entirety of Ukrainian territory. What's to stop them? They would take out the Ukrainian anti-air defenses. This may already be happening, and very quickly establish supremacy in the skies and impose a no-fly zone. In doing that, they would effectively be ending the battle. I don't think the Ukrainian forces would even attempt to put up much opposition under such a scenario.
And Vladimir Putin came out pretty very strong language, basically calling it, I believe he might have even used this term, a fascist junta that was installed in 2014, and basically saying that the object of this limited military operation is to demilitarize the Ukraine as a country. And I assume that means destroy a lot of the weapons that NATO and the US and Britain have been plying them with, and also to denazification of Ukraine. So he's calling that out. By the way, the Western media is saying he's calling Zelensky a Nazi and Zelensky is Jewish and so forth. So they're already gaslighting that talking point to get away from talking about the Azov battalions and all the very extreme far-right militias and paramilitaries that the U.S. has been backing for so long there. But so what do you think about that, the denazification of Ukraine and bringing them to justice for the Odessa massacre and all the rest of it? That's pretty serious, Peter.
Indeed, and this is it would be consistent with a strategy of trying to prompt an internal collapse without need for an actual Russian invasion. It might be enough to prompt internal collapse by provoking flight by those who fit the description of Ukrainian pro-Nazis, and judging by the convoys making their way out of Kiev, that might actually be happening. One can expect other steps consistent with such a strategy of causing internal collapse without even having to put many boots on the ground. Economic collapse is part of that picture as well.
Yes, that's quite a ways down the road, the economic collapse part. But the political collapse, like you said, Peter, without even having to really fire a shot, so to speak, where do you think I don't see President Zelensky, a former actor who's been in power for a couple of years, I don't see him with a strong support base, a legacy base. I see the potential for a lot of fractiousness in Kiev, because people might eventually be blaming each other for what's happening. Do you think is that where it's headed in Kiev? Do you think, Peter?
Well, I'm not an expert on Ukraine domestic politics, but I do recognize the tactics being used here by Russia. I think they have a concerted information strategy, and part of it is to encourage internal collapse. And I think they have a much better reading of Ukrainian domestic politics than the wishful thinking Western politicians have.
So you think the Russians actually have a better reading on the Ukrainian domestic situation than Boris Johnson does? I mean, come on, Peter. Come on.
That's yeah. I think the half the population of Ukraine wasn't Russian anyway, and I think the vast majority of Ukrainians speak Russian as well as Ukrainian.
What about Ben Wallace, UK Defense Secretary, made a comment. It was caught on camera yesterday. He said he was talking to some of the guards, soldiers there in a meeting room. He says, "Well, we kicked the Tsar's butt in 1850, and we can do it again." I mean, in the Crimean War, he's talking about. I mean, what do you think about those sorts of comments? I mean,
it's deplorable. It's infantile. In a word, it's infantile. The entire conduct of British foreign policy is infantile. I mean, the country is being led by a manifest clown, and he's aided and abetted by the likes of Wallace, who thinks it's funny to make jokes about the carnage of the Crimean War in the context of an ongoing conflict with Ukraine, and boasting about it. This kind of it is so typically British imperial thinking that what happened 150 years ago is the template of what's happening now. We cannot get over ourselves, can we?
Yeah, historically and in the present day, I just see an unballasted, rudderless culture, or political culture anyway, political leadership. But lastly, we've got a couple of minutes left, and we're going to wrap this up. It's been a great discussion, Peter. But you mentioned the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, his calls on the floor of the House of Commons to ban RT, the Russian international broadcaster. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, it's shocking, but not surprising. Steadily since Starmer stabbed Jeremy Corbyn in the back and helped get rid of him as leader, Corbyn has been moving the party to the right on every level. As leader, Corbyn has been moving the party to the right on every level. We saw this during the COVID crisis, when Labour wanted even more authoritarian measures than those brought in by the nominally right-wing Conservative government. And in the same way, he's demanding even more restrictions, sanctions against Russia, including the silencing of dissent on the part of RT. I mean, this should be coming from a party which not many years ago brought in a Freedom of Information Act speaks volumes for the trajectory that Labour has been on. It is now not just indistinguishable from right-wing Tories, but it's trying to outflank the Tories on the right.
Yes, yeah, that's a comment I've heard other people make as well, and not to mention Keir Starmer seems to have played a role when he was the head of the CPS in basically putting Julian Assange in that incredible, impossible position between the Swedish judiciary, the UK law enforcement, and the Americans as well, that led to him effectively being on ice and in arbitrary detention for so long. So, I mean, there's that too, but yeah, it's the British political side of things is not pretty at all. Certainly, I don't know what to say about that other than I'm trying to.
There are no voices currently in Britain calling for caution, calling for even simple consideration of sanctions backfiring on us. Nobody's asking, well, what if what if Russia retaliates? Nobody's even asking that basic question, and yet we know, and not long ago we were trumpeting about Russia's cyber capacity. Are we not worried about possible Russian cyber attacks on our financial infrastructure? I tell you, I've stocked up already on cash from before the banks closed down, and I recommend others do the same.
Wow. Well, that's something to think about too. Well, there's a lot to think about. Things are happening really quickly, and we want to thank you, Peter Ford, former UK ambassador to Syria and Bahrain, for joining us for this very, very important discussion. Certainly, we hope there's going to be more discussions and more analysis on this, that we're able to do that. And thankfully, we have networks like this, like TNT. We can also see more analysis at 21stcenturywire.com. Thank you, Peter Ford, for joining us today.
Thank you, Patrick, for offering an outlet for voices of sanity.
Well, we're going to try our best. Thank you, Peter. And thank you to everybody for tuning in on this live broadcast. And also thank you to our new listeners. I've seen quite a few come through the Telegram pipeline. Very much appreciated. And listen, we'll see you on Sunday. Tune into the Sunday Wire on ACR, 21st Century Wire. We'll be there. We've got hopefully a nice lineup of guests for Sunday. And then I'll see you here on TNT next Tuesday, 12 p.m. UK time, and Thursday as well. We'll have a lot to talk about. I'm absolutely certain of it. But listen, take care, everybody. Hope you have a great weekend.